Hello, and welcome to Field Lab Earth, the podcast that's all about past and present advances in the fields of agronomic, crop, soil, and environmental sciences. Today, we'll be talking to Dr. Alex Ceseski about using seeding depth to battle herbicide resistance in Californian rice. Californian rice farmers, primarily growers for sushi rice, have limited options when it comes to combating weeds. Available herbicide options are few, the fields are rarely rotated, and waiting for weeds to germinate for early herbicide applications can cause delays to planting. However, all hope is not lost for you sushi fans out there. This episode, Alex discusses how deeper seeding depths may be another tool in the California Rice Weed Toolkit. Don't forget to stick around to the end to listen to our new Student Spotlight section as well. We'll talk more about all that in a minute, but before we dive in, we want to thank our sponsors, starting with Meter Group. Meter specializes in robust soil moisture sensing, innovative weather monitoring, cloud data logging, advanced data visualization software, and more. Their well-published scientific instrumentation is used worldwide in universities, research and testing labs, government agencies, agriculture, and industrial applications. Listen to their new podcast, We Measure the World, to hear how innovative researchers leverage environmental data to make our world a better and more sustainable place at metergroup.com/fieldlabearth. Our second sponsor is Gasmet Technologies, the maker of the GT5000 Terra, the smallest portable FTIR multi-gas analyzer for greenhouse gas and environmental research. Measure carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, ammonia, and water vapor in real time simultaneously from static or automated chambers and ruminant emissions. Visit www.gasmet.com, that's Gasmet spelled Gasmet, or email sales@gasmet.com for more information. I'm your host, Abby Morrison. Let's talk about science. Hi everyone, welcome to the show. Today we have Alex Ceseski with us. Alex is a weed scientist and rice agronomist working with Dr. Qasim Al-Khatib at University of California, Davis. His principal areas of research are rice and weed biology, competition between crop and weeds, the ecology of rice systems, and how different rice planting methods influence those factors. Welcome to the show, Alex. How are you doing today?
Well, thanks, Abby. I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on the show.
Oh, we're so glad to have you. So today, as people might have guessed from your bio, we are talking about rice and weeds. So just to get started, can you give us some background on just rice in the U.S., how it's grown, how that might differ? I know a lot of people kind of have like the terraced pond imagery in mind when they think of rice farming. So are we close to that in the U.S.? Are we different? What does rice look like in the U.S.?
Right. So I'm certain that the image that probably most folks who aren't living in an area adjacent to rice growing fields in the U.S. probably have this imagery in their head of this beautiful rice terraces that you would see throughout Southeast Asia. These wonderful hillsides with folks stooped over transplanting rice. We definitely do have a fair amount of rice acreage in the U.S., but unfortunately, it looks a lot more boring than that. It's a fully mechanized system, and it's grown on broad acres, much like a wheat and small grains and corn. Just that the cropping system itself might be different from state to state. So rice grown in the United States is grown in two main areas. We have what we call the Mid-South, which is going to be along the Mississippi River watershed, and then a small part of the near the Gulf Coast of Texas. And the Mid-South area, besides the portion of Texas that I mentioned, is going to include a large acreage in Arkansas, some in the Boot Heel of Missouri, some Mississippi, and a fair amount in Louisiana as well. And then in addition to that area, we have the California rice growing region, which is a very large portion of the northern San Joaquin Valley, which is an area that we call the Sacramento Valley. So essentially everything north of Sacramento and roughly speaking south of, say, Chico, California.
Okay. And then are rice fields flooded all the time? I feel like I always understood that they just always had to be flooded, but then in working here, I've started to realize maybe that's not the case. So can you talk about that aspect of rice farming?
Right. So it's certainly a common sight to, if you're ever driving past a rice field, to see that it appears to be in standing water, and it's a natural assumption that it would be throughout the season. That is actually the case in most of California, whereas in the Mid-South, most of the rice that is grown there is not flooded throughout the entirety of the season. It's generally what we call flush irrigated for maybe the first 30 to 40 days, and then it is flooded for the remainder of the season. So it would say somewhere on the order of 2/3 of the season is permanently flooded in those areas.
Okay, and then you said flush flooding. What is that?
So that's a good question. So flushing is the practice of momentarily bringing water onto the field, just enough to cover the field very shallowly and provide enough water for the plants to be happy, and then shutting the water and letting that percolate in, and the soil dries down a bit over the next few days or week or so. And this is a practice to allow the weeds to germinate and give time for growers to apply herbicides and whatever, if they need insecticides or fungicides. And generally, by the time the rice is robust and tall enough to withstand flooding, they would bring the flood water. And the U.S. Mid-South is probably somewhere in the order of 2 to 3 inches. Whereas in California, the field is permanently flooded to 4 or even more inches from even before the seeding until the end of the season.
Okay. I'm going to ask a side question. How does, hopefully this isn't too much of a rabbit trail, how does rice just like not die from being underwater? Like immediately right off the bat? Like how, that's a very foolish question perhaps, but I'm very curious.
Right, so that's an excellent question, and it's actually a really interesting question, and I would encourage listeners to look up more information on this topic if they want to, because it is actually really fascinating. But the best we can tell is that cultivated rice is a cousin of some marshy species that were found in South China and Southeast Asia several thousand years ago, and these were species that were able to survive in a flooded, and especially in a flooded environment where the flood water could rise up and overtop the plants. And so rice has a lot of adaptations that allow it to survive in a lot of different conditions of varying amounts of floodwater depth. But essentially, especially in particularly concerning rice grown in the U.S., rice, though it's a small grain, does have a fairly large grain, and it has a really high metabolic efficiency. And unfortunately, I can't recall the exact process or the compounds involved at this moment. But in a nutshell, the rice is able to very efficiently make a metabolic process that allows it to scavenge the CO2 and the oxygen it needs out of its own reserves and out of the top millimeter or so anaerobic soil layer, in order to grow quickly enough to escape from floodwaters that are in California that are as deep as 8 inches.
Wow. Okay. Two sub questions off of that. So if it's relying on oxygen that's in like the top layer of the soil, then is it like necessary that these are like drained at some point to like get more oxygen in the soil, or is it just like now we're fine? Like it's always going to have enough?
So it's because rice as a small grain actually has a fairly large grain and has a large amount of seed reserves, that's able to grow pretty rapidly in the conditions that we grow it in the U.S. And so even in California, where we maintain deep floodwaters throughout the season, it can generally emerge fairly quickly inside of a week from soil depths of up to 4 inches. Certainly in cooler weather, it might be slowed down a bit, and that can hinder the emergence. But it's just once the rice is able to breach the surface, then it can get all the CO2 and atmospheric oxygen that it needs for respiration just from its leaves at that point.
Okay. So rice has like a strong hustle game. It's like we gotta get up there. Okay.
That's
and
true.
Then final like amateur question here. When you're planting rice, are you just like throwing what most people would think of as rice? I don't know if grain or kernel or whatever is the correct terminology here. Are you just like throwing rice out there? I mean, not throwing, but is that what you're using, or is there like a separate seed of some kind?
So the rice that you buy in the store is, if it's white rice, it's fully milled rice, and that has had all of the germ and the bran removed. So that's most of the protein and the insoluble fiber. And so what you have is just the endosperm, or just the starchy bits. The brown rice you buy at the store, on the other hand, does still contain the germ and the bran, and so we'd say that's less milled or less processed. And that's about as close to the rice from a plant as you're going to find in the store. The difference between rice from a plant and, say, brown rice you'd find at the store really is just the presence of the hull. And so rice that's fallen off a plant and still has the hull is perfectly viable to plant as seed. Absolutely. And so in a sense, in a lot of parts of the world, in fact, you would see that what you have is just rice that was collected from plants in seed nurseries, probably the previous season, and that's just being broadcast out in the field. In the U.S., what you would see is there's a kind of a bifurcation in the two dominant seeding strategies in the U.S. In the Mid-South, they typically put the seed in a grain drill, which anyone who's familiar with wheat or barley or corn or even some vegetable crops are familiar with seeing. And the seed is put into a hopper, and the grain drill is able to plant the seed in these rows 7 to 10 inch apart, and then just plant them along a row line. Whereas in California, they actually do drop the seed directly into the field. It's just that the seed itself is not dried. It's generally soaked in water for 24 or 36 hours. And what this does is this allows the seed to imbibe some water and gain some weight, but it also pre-germinates it a little bit, and it gives it sort of it gives it a little bit of a running start when it's flown into this 4-inch flood. That extra water helps it sink down to the soil surface where it can grow roots.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much for letting me just completely derail this, take us on a bunch of rabbit trails. But I think it is helpful to kind of set the stage for the next section of our conversation. So you already mentioned this a little bit earlier about weeds and when they germinate and how that relates to planting strategies. So the research in the paper that we are discussing today, you are working a lot with kind of the weed problem in California rice specifically. So can you give us some more background on that whole issue?
Okay, so this is going to be a bit of a complicated scenario, and I'm going to do my best to try to mention a bunch of seemingly disparate points and then tie together how they all interact. But mentioning previously that California rice is actually grown by dropping the pre-germinated seed into a permanently flooded field, and this is done by aircraft. So this was a technique that was adopted in the 1920s as a means to suppress competitive grasses, which are really predominant in California. To kind of paint a picture here, in the U.S. Mid-South, there's a lot more humidity and warmer nights, and they grow the kind of rice that you would see in a Thai restaurant or an Indian restaurant or Mexican Central American cuisine. It's an indica variety of rice. Typically, they're long grain rice. In California, the rice that is grown was actually brought here largely by Chinese immigrants that were railroad workers, and this is a japonica variety, and this is more of a sticky rice that you would find certainly in a lot more Chinese and Japanese cuisine. And in fact, the rice that's grown currently is predominantly sushi rice. And in California, we have drier conditions, a lot less disease pressure, and a much heavier soils and much more grass pressure. And so these conditions, on the one hand, allowed and on the other hand, forced the growers to start looking at deep floodwaters throughout the season as a means to suppress grasses. And just by happenstance, the rice cultivars that they have in California are really, really well suited to growing rapidly and escaping this deep floodwater. And because of the deep flooding condition, that really limits the means by which you can apply herbicides. And essentially, the only way that they could apply herbicides was by air. So by the time that chemical herbicides were introduced in the 60s and going forward, you already have a limitation of what herbicides you can use to attack the weeds that are able to come through the flood. And then when you put on top of that the stringent regulatory structure that's in place in California, especially in terms of drift from sprays of these aerially applied herbicides, which we have a lot of high-value orchards that might be right adjacent to a rice field. And then you have concerns of contamination of the tailwater, which is the water that would run off the field and go into the delta. Again, that further compresses the amount of herbicides that you have. And then another layer is that because the soil is fairly high in clay, there isn't a lot of culture of rotation in California rice. Typically, rice growers are growing rice year after year after year, and there aren't any cover crops in the winter or any winter crops because the growers are incentivized to flood the field over winter. And actually, this provides significant ecosystem services. By the way, the Pacific migratory flyway was partially reestablished in a lot of areas when growers started flooding the fields over winter. That because we have a rice monoculture and because they only grow it in one method, okay, so now all of our weeds are adapted to this permanently flooded condition, but we don't have a lot of herbicides available to use on them. And so what you have is essentially this kind of race to the bottom where you have a handful of weeds already adapted to the flooding, handful of herbicides, and now we have overuse of the herbicides, and this has provided a lot of environment for selection pressure for herbicide-resistant weeds. And we've had herbicide-resistant weeds in California since the late 80s, but it really exploded in the 2000s as we started actually have fewer herbicides on the market as some were taken off of label for various environmental concerns.
So you, in your research then, are trying to find solutions to this obviously very complicated issue. So can you tell us about the hypothesis that you had going into this research and how you've been testing it both in the greenhouse and in the field?
Okay, so when we're looking at a problem like herbicide resistance, and especially looking at it through the unique lens of the California rice, not just ecosystem, but also economic system. The California rice industry is basically optimized for business as usual. There isn't a lot of incentive to adopt alternative stand establishment methods for California rice because the infrastructure around aerial seeding, aerial application of fertilizers, and aerial application of pesticides is very robust and fully amortized, and really it's fairly inexpensive. And from a grower perspective, it's basically zero labor intensive because it's the flying services that do the actual applications. And so the very, very few handful of growers that do drill seeding, which again is practiced predominantly in the Mid-South area, typically are on the fringes, physically on the fringes of the rice growing area where the soil might be a little lighter, or where there might be some incentive economically to do some rotation into high-value crops every few years. And so when we're looking at combating herbicide resistance, and we know that there aren't a lot of herbicides coming out of the market, kind of by necessity, we're looking towards more integrated strategies to try to work on this. And so in looking for an integrated strategy to try to look at herbicide resistance and see if there was a way to re-implement or reintroduce drill seeding as an alternative methodology, we had to look at what we really couldn't do with drill seeding. The problem with drill seeding in general is that the seed in the South is planted very shallowly. It's planted to about 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch depth. I mentioned that the rice grown in the U.S. Mid-South is indica variety, and this is a variety that has a lower seedling vigor than the japonica cultivars that we grow in California. And the problem with shallower planting in a drill seeded condition is that the rice is going to emerge the same time as the weeds. And in California, because we have such a high pressure of competitive grasses, what that does is that would force you to rely even more on the herbicides that you're already using. And it brings in the extra wrinkle of having, you're basically losing all of the competitive advantage that you're giving the rice from the flooded condition. Even though there are some fringe benefits to drill seeding beyond that I can go into a moment. So basically our idea was, we know that the rice has sufficient seedling vigor to escape floodwaters and average 4 inches of floodwaters in California, even as deep as 8 inches in organic systems. So we thought, well, what if we just planted the rice deeper? The idea being that most of the weeds that you're going to see in a season are going to grow out of the top 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch of soil. So if you can plant the rice deeper than that, if you can plant it 1, 2, or even 3 inches deep, which is common in a crop such as corn, the rice would then emerge after the majority of weeds have germinated. And this would open up a whole host of options for weed control, whether it would be chemical weed control with different herbicides that aren't available in California rice, or shallow tillage and cultivation, or flaming, which, of course, would probably be cost prohibitive. But we wanted to just see if it would work at all and do a proof of concept on a biological sense. And so our first few field seasons were done as a test bed to see if this would even work at all, if you could get the rice out of the soil. And what we found in our first 2 years was not very promising. And so what we ended up doing was going to the greenhouse and doing some rice seedling biology studies, which were the subject of the paper that we're talking about today. So what we were finding in our first couple of field seasons was that the rice cultivar that we're using, which we call M206, which is a medium grain variety that has matures early in the season, and it's the sixth sequential release of that particular germplasm, didn't seem to be performing too well when drill seeded at depths below about 1/2 an inch, and it wasn't getting out of the soil very well. And we wanted to see if any of the other California cultivars actually could. And we know that there are a handful of cultivars that have a somewhat larger seed weight, and our initial thought was that possibly these higher seed weight varieties would have more seed reserves and maybe have a little more oomph to get out of the soil. And so we designed a couple of experiments in the greenhouse where we would evaluate several of these cultivars for their various responses to burial depth in the soil, up to about 3 inches. And what we wanted to look at was germination, their seedling elongation under the soil, and the elongation of the various seedling organs under the soil, how rapidly they grew through the soil, and sort of their relative vigor. We wanted to find out how quickly they were able to emerge and how evenly they were able to emerge, what the terminal percentage of emergence was, and then what the early season characteristics of these cultivars were. Were they suffering any sort of reduced vigor as established plants afterwards? Were they stunted or were they wimpy looking?
Hi everyone, I hope you're enjoying the show. Interested in learning more? Alex's paper, Seeding Depth Effects on Elongation, Emergence, and Early Development of California Rice Varieties, published in Crop Science, will be freely available for the next 2 weeks. If you are a certified crop advisor or certified professional soil scientist, you can take a quiz for continuing education units for this episode, which can be found in our show notes or on certifiedcropadvisor.org. Thanks again also to our sponsors, Gazmet Technologies and Meter Group. For Gazmet Technologies, the GT5000 Terra is a robust and portable multi-gas analyzer for field work weighing 20.7 pounds. The GT5000 Terra is splash-proof IP54 rated with an internal pump and battery and instantaneous readings of up to 50 gases at sub-ppm concentrations. Check out the quick setup guide and learn more about Gazmet Technologies at www.gazmet.com and the links in the show notes. Meter specializes in robust soil moisture sensing, innovative weather monitoring, cloud data logging, advanced data visualization software, and more. Their well-published scientific instrumentation is used worldwide in universities, research and testing labs, government agencies, agriculture, and industrial applications. Listen to their new podcast, We Measure the World, to hear how innovative researchers leverage environmental data to make our world a better and more sustainable place at metergroup.com/fieldlabearth. Thank you for being our sponsor. Let's get back to the show. And what did you find?
So the cultivars that we tested, and we used the cultivar that we had been using all along, which we call M206. Now these names are not they're all gonna sound essentially the same. So I'll tell you what I'll tell you what their characteristics are. We use cultivar M105, and this is a medium grain that is a rice that matures very early in the season. And we wanted to try this cultivar out because we thought that if there were emergence delays from being planted deep in the soil that a normal cultivar might experience a shortened season because of that, and then consequently might have a reduced yield. And we thought that an earlier maturing variety might be a good fit for this kind of system. And then we used the M206, which is the one that we had been using in the field that we didn't get very good results with. The next cultivar we used was M205, which was basically one generation previous to M206, but this was a cultivar that had a higher seed weight and a higher yield potential, but also was a later maturing variety. And the final cultivar that we used was at the time the most recent cultivar, which was M209. And M209 is very similar to the previous M205, which I just mentioned, which had the later maturing date, but the larger seed weight and the higher yield potential. And so what we found was that of all the cultivars, M105, which was the cultivar that had the earliest maturing and that we thought might be suitable for deeper burial, actually in all aspects of all studies performed the worst. This is a cultivar that did not have very good emergence, very good elongation, a very low seed figure at pretty much any depth below 1/2 inch. And what we did find is that the two larger seeded varieties actually did have much higher amounts of relative seedling figure, faster elongation under the soil, quicker emergence, more even emergence, and more robust early season seedlings, established seedlings, than the M206, which was our bogey that we had. In general, we were finding that rice that was planted up to about 1 inch could have 70% or more emergence. However, cultivar M209, even when planted at 2 inches, was able to achieve almost 90% emergence. And that was actually really shocking. We weren't expecting to see this. When a grass seed is planted deeper in the soil profile, the elongating organ actually is comprised of 2 organs called a coleoptile and a mesocotyl. The coleoptile is the portion that is growing towards the soil surface and actually breaches the soil surface. And the mesocotyl is a secondary organ that grows between the seed itself and the coleoptile. So you could imagine as the coleoptile is the upper portion and the mesocotyl is the lower portion. We had read a lot of studies that were trying to establish a correlation between coleoptile or mesocotyl length and rice seedling figure. And what we had found was that there wasn't really any correlation, but we found that there was a lot of variability in coleoptile elongation rapidity. And looking at our 4 cultivars, what we found is that the coleoptile of M209 was elongating the most rapidly of all of the 4 cultivars that we had. And we had some correlations that we weren't able to include in the study because they didn't have enough data points, but it was looking promising. It just wasn't statistically robust enough. But the coleoptile, once it reaches the surface, it opens up and then the first true leaf emerges. And so this is sort of the I would call the battering ram portion that gets through the soil. And that needs to have enough, rigidity and enough force behind it to actually push through the soil. And what we find is that there's an interaction between the coleoptile and the mesocotyl below it, or the mesocotyl can help. Once the coleoptile reaches its terminal length, the mesocotyl can actually help push it the rest of the way through the soil. And so what we found was that M209 had a rapidly growing coleoptile, and then apparently a very vigorous mesocotyl would help push it through the soil and reach the surface. And so M209, which was very quickly emerging as sort of our superstar variety, was able to have not just a high total emergence from the soil, but it was also emerging very rapidly and very evenly. And by that I mean from even a depth of 2 inches, the M209 was starting to emerge from the soil within 4 days after planting. In terms of germination and emergence, the key metric that we tend to look for, besides your terminal amount, is the time to 50% germination and time to 50% emergence. And the differences between the 4 cultivars were pretty stark, especially at the lower seeding depths. It was like ducks in a row, where you would have the lowest or the quickest time to 50% emergence with M209, followed by M205, which was the other we suspected higher vigor variety, followed by M206, which was the variety that we had used previously in the field, followed by M105, which was pretty obviously the sort of the weakest of the 4 cultivars.
Wow, that's really promising results. That's great news. I'm like reminded of like how rockets go off into space, where they have like those like extra like push rockets that then just like fall off, and they're like, "Nah, we did our job. We're good. You can keep going without us." So sorry, maybe that's a bad analogy, but anyway. So obviously you had some promising results to start. What are your next steps with this then, and future research, going back in the field, testing more, like where are we going with this?
Right. So because we found such surprising results with the M209 cultivar, and it seemed to have such a high degree of seedling vigor, that was really heartening for us, because it gave us an incentive to go back into the field to try this cultivar out, and specifically to do cultivar comparisons in the field between M209, our high vigor cultivar, which we now realized, and M206, which we had used previously, and we currently kind of using that as a baseline for performance. And so the subsequent years of research did confirm that M209 actually performed really, really well in the field. At seeding depths of up to even 2 inches, we got great stands, and we were able to achieve really good weed control with that. And so now we've been working on looking at the economics and logistics, and this is a pretty sticky issue, because we can prove the basic biology proof of concept that the rice actually has the vigor to get out of the soil. At that point, it's all just management practices. We've been using glyphosate as a what we call a burn down application, where the weeds are coming up just before the rice emerges, and then you knock down the weeds, and then once your rice comes up, you're able to control the remaining emerging weeds with typical rice herbicide. So what this is doing is it enables us to use a herbicide that's not available inside the rice season, which would normally kill the rice. This does unfortunately provide new pressure for herbicide resistance to develop. I mean, certainly anytime you add a new herbicide, you're just kicking the can down the road a bit. But what this does is it potentially opens the door for growers to rotate into drill seeding maybe every third year or so, rather than relying on Roundup, which we already know over-reliance on Roundup has led to a lot of resistance in a lot of crops. What this can do is introduce a lot of fringe benefits to drill seeding, because what drill seeding can provide without just outside of herbicides is it provides the rice a place to root below the soil surface, which it does not have in the standard California air-seeded condition. What that means is that we don't have a problem with lodging in drill seeding. Lodging is when the crop tends to fall over, and we have a lot of high winds in the Central Valley. So that surface seeded rice, especially late in the season when they drop the water down and get ready to dry the soil down for harvest, a lot of times the rice can blow over, and that can cause significant harvest losses, because it's just really hard to harvest rice that's lodged. Well, the lodging that we found in the drill seeded rice is 0%. And even if you have a stand reduction, I think you can make up for a little bit of a loss of stand by maintaining your yields. So another benefit that the drill seeding can provide growers, again, outside of even using the rice planting depth as a tool or using extra herbicides as a tool, is that because we are flush irrigating for the first 30 to 40 days, that actually is suppressing algae, and it's suppressing aquatic weeds, which are a big problem in California rice. And so just water management alone can achieve a large proportion of the integrated pest management aims without having to get the herbicides involved. And so if you have a sedge or a aquatic weed that is herbicide resistant, you don't even need to use a herbicide to control it. You can just use water management in this system. And algae is also a big problem in water-seeded rice, because if the algae develops on the surface of the water and your rice is below it, of course the algae is going to shade the rice, and it's going to slow the rice down, and it can really, really inhibit your stand emergence and cause weaker stands. With drill seeding, because you're flush irrigating for the first month or so, the algae doesn't get a chance to really establish, and by the time you bring the flood waters, the rice is already above the flood level, and so algae, it might be competitive in terms of using phosphorus in the water, but it's not competitive at all with the rice at that point. So it's a non-issue from that perspective. And so even outside of the herbicide picture, rotating with drill seeding could provide growers with a nice option for using an integrated method of weed management and using an integrated method of resistance management.
Wow, that sounds really promising. That's great news. Well, best of luck also on your future research. Sounds like that's going to be great. I have 3 questions left for you today. The first one is, if people want to learn more about anything that we've talked about today, or even the research you're doing now, where can they go to get more information?
Well, there are a couple of websites that you can find. CalRice.org is sort of a gateway to the California rice growing community in general, and that can link you. That would provide a lot of valuable information about how California rice is grown, and also link you to some of the websites of the grower cooperative that does all the breeding and maintains the germplasm for California rice. As to information about our research or any other research on rice or rice weeds or rice nutrition, you can go to rice.ucanr.edu, which is the portal to the University of California's Rice Research and Extension program. And this is the weed scientists like myself and Dr. Qasim Al-Khatib, and the mineral toxicity nutritionists like Dr. Bruce Lindquist, and other entomologists and IPM practitioners. And there's a lot of really useful information, just from a general interest perspective, but also from growers looking for helpful tips and techniques perspective.
Great. Well, you've kind of somewhat then answered my next question, which is, if people want to then take that next step to get involved, that could be as a researcher or a farmer, general public, how can people get involved with this method of farming or research?
Oh, yeah, definitely. If anyone is interested in learning more about our research in particular, my professor, Dr. Qasim Al-Khatib, his email and phone number are on the rice.ucanr.edu links, contact us portion of the website. And my contact information is also included on the podcast itself. And I plan on hanging out for a bit and continuing this research, particularly in looking at the economics and logistics of this program versus the standard practices. So I'll be around for a while.
Great. Yeah, we'll for sure have your information and links to all those resources in the show notes. Final question. What is one fun fact that listeners would not know about you if all they had was your research?
I can do the splits.
Wow. That's great. I for sure cannot, so.
Well, at least I could before COVID. Yoga sort of dried up there, so maybe not as well as I could. But, give me a few weeks to get back and I could probably still do it.
Wow, that's very impressive. Well, great. What a fun fact. What a promising research project. Thank you so much for being on the show today, and thank you for your time and best wishes on your research.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to our Student Spotlight, where we highlight the work of graduate and undergraduate society student members. Today, we'll be talking to Carlos. Welcome to the show. Can you start us off by introducing yourself and where you're studying?
Sure. Hi, Abby. First of all, thank you for the opportunity today. I'm Carlos Pires, or Pires for my fellow Americans. I'm a third-year PhD student in the Agronomy department at Kansas State. And I want to say I'm a fan of the podcast. And in fact, the Field Lab Earth podcast inspired me to create my own podcast.
Oh, wonderful. What is the name of your show?
Agro Connection. It's a podcast to connect Brazilian and American agriculture.
All right. We will include a link to that in our show notes. And Carlos, what are you currently researching?
My research focuses on testing agricultural practices to improve soil health at the farm level. And we pay special attention to soil microbes. Part of my research efforts are to conduct statewide on-farm studies to measure and communicate the economic and environmental benefits of different agricultural practices, such as use of cover crops or nutrient management, to generate recommendations for farmers to improve their farm's productivity and sustainability. And my project has a strong extension component, and I have helped to organize soil health field days to share my findings and raise awareness with farmers and the general public as well about the importance of soil health for making agriculture more resilient and sustainable. And over the course of 4 years, these field days have brought together over 700 people, and we call this project as the Kansas Soil Health Partnership.
Great. And if you could have your dream research project, what would that look like?
Well, I guess I can say I'm already kind of doing my dream project with the Kansas Soil Health Partnership. I really like this approach of on-farm research and communicating with farmers. And since we are actually helping farmers to conduct on-farm research, I thought it was necessary to enhance the communication and outreach of our program. So I got some funds from SARE to develop a project called Using On-Farm Soil Health to Engage Research and Education Towards Sustainable Agriculture. And my ultimate goal will be to develop a soil health network on the entire Midwest in partnership with multiple universities, maybe a global partnership actually, to foster soil health and sustainable ag in the most productive area of the U.S.
Awesome. Well, if you'd like to get in touch with Carlos about his work, we'll have his contact information in our show notes. Thank you so much for being on the show today, and best wishes on your future studies, podcast, and career. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to Field Lab Earth. More information can be found in the description below. Thank you.